Greetings to all you Herle Burlyites far and wide. Let's get right to today's pod. We've been wanting to do a deep dive into this topic for quite a while now, and the day has finally come. We're going to talk housing and housing affordability, all the related social and economic issues to that, and hopefully get down to some potential solutions and things that might actually happen in the near term. With a bespoke panel we've put together to discuss it from a number of different angles. Joining me are Mike Moffatt. Mike is currently the assistant professor in the Business, Economics, and Public Policy group at the Ivey Business School and senior director, policy and innovation at the Smart Prosperity Institute. Those are good titles. Previously, Mike was the chief innovation officer for the Government of Canada, advising deputy ministers on innovation policy and emerging trends. I like the fact that he specified deputy ministers there. Diana Petramala is the director in the economic advisory team at Altus Group. Ms. Petramala has spent the bulk of her career conducting economic and real estate research. Previously, she was the senior economist at the Center for Urban Research and Land Development at Ryerson University, analyzing the impact of demographics and government policy on housing markets and urban growth. Adam Vaughan is former Liberal MP and a Toronto City Councillor. He's our insider on government on this panel, and he's just joined the School of Cities at the University of Toronto as a Canadian urban leader. As Parliamentary Secretary for Housing in the Trudeau government, he played a leading role in the creation of Canada's first national housing strategy and led a task force to revisit and reorient the federal government's approach to ending homelessness. And Mukhtar Latif, based in Vancouver, is a developer and affordable housing consultant with 30 years' experience in the public and private sectors. His expertise is in developing affordable housing policies, products, and programs, including modular housing, resettlement projects, and community planning. Thanks you all for making time in your clearly busy schedules to have this conversation with me today on the Herle Burly. Where do I find everybody today? Adam, you're in Ottawa, you said?
I'm in Ottawa waiting to see what's in the budget. It's housing is top of mind up here, and it's a far cry from where I arrived in 2014 when no one wanted to talk about housing, and now no one doesn't want to talk about. Nobody wants to talk about anything but housing. So it's hopefully a good budget.
So Diana, you're in Toronto?
Yep, Toronto, in my condo downtown Toronto. So you might hear some construction and garbage trucks in the background.
Is that where you're working from these days, or have you gone back to some sort of office?
Yeah, I'm in the office 3 times a week.
Okay, interesting. More ambitious than most people I know. Mike, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm in Ottawa as well, just in the glebe, and I don't hear any noise outside, which is a far cry from February and March. So I'm enjoying the silence.
You're going through diesel fume withdrawal.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not used to this clean air. It's a wonder.
Hey, Mukhtar, how are you? It's nice to meet you.
I'm good. I mean, I'm actually in London, UK, rather than London, Ontario. So, so enjoying life in England. Well, so much. I mean, we're getting together to a post-COVID, if there is such a thing, family get together. We've been missing our kids for a little while, so they're coming together for Easter.
Very nice. I hear housing's cheap in London.
Yeah, cheap as chips. But just as scary as anywhere else in the world at the moment.
Okay. Well, I want to spend our time together today trying to figure this thing out, not just talk about how bad it is. But I actually do encounter people of my vintage who will dispute the fact that it is more difficult to purchase a home now for young people than it was when they themselves were young. And so for those people that are still in some denial about this, could each of you give me an example of something that you think illustrates just how difficult it is for people to get housing at a reasonable cost right now?
Well, I think... Oh, yep, go ahead, Adam.
I'm going to ground this conversation in the reality that we far too often aren't talking about as we talk about the housing crisis, and that's homelessness. thousands of people in tents and ravines in Toronto alone, let alone in Vancouver and Winnipeg and Edmonton. The fact that we have on any given night close to 50,000 Canadians without shelter, and close to 250,000 Canadians a year, closer to 300,000 now, experiencing homelessness, it tells you there's a significant crisis of profound proportion, and it ricochets up the housing ladder. We're also equally aware that people that are on the rung of being a tenant, reaching for the next rung up, which is home ownership, that rung isn't there for a lot of people, and those people are getting frustrated, they're getting angry, and they are gathering a lot of noise and momentum and political capital, and they are about to unleash it on somebody. And so the housing crisis has got to be addressed and it's got to be solved. But if you think being on the rung and looking up and it looks bleak, try looking down. It's even bleaker. And if we don't solve homelessness, we are going to drive all kinds of problems into our country in ways in which that I just don't want to imagine in terms of the human cost of homelessness. It's getting worse, and there are a lot of factors that have to be addressed. But it's if you think looking up is tough, try looking down.
Mike, you were going to say something?
Yeah, so I'll add to that, though. This is going to sound a little petty after not talking about homelessness, because I'm going to talk about sort of up the ladder a little bit. So we can look at data points. So the proportion of 25 to 34-year-olds who own a home has been dropping. The proportion of 25 to 34-year-olds who live with a parent has been going up. So we can look at those data points, but I'd also just argue that the thing about progress is things are supposed to get better over time, right? So even if we said that, okay, things are just as bad as they were in 1977 when the Jays were founded, I don't think that's a positive thing. I think I think these metrics should be going up. So even if we want to debate how much worse things are today, society should be getting better, and it's not.
Dan, what do you think?
I'll just add to sort of the constraints that young households are facing when looking for a house. And when boomers particularly were coming of age, entering that home buyer stage, so they're 25 to 44 years of age, we were building significantly more housing for every new household than we are building now. In particular, we were building more ground-related single-family homes back then, significantly more than we are now. So supply or the housing that is available for young families is not as vast as it was for the boomers.
Mukhtar, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say it is all of the above, and I think the concept around identifying a particular group and focusing our resources in that, I accept that homelessness is a huge challenge and it's growing. And part of the reason is that people are being pushed down the ladder because they can't afford to stay where they are. And what we saw in Vancouver was when we set a target, or the mayor did back in 2008 to end homelessness by 2015. And we found as we move forward that there's a whole range of other factors that come in to play, whether that's seniors that have been evicted out of old existing rental, whether it's young people that can't step out of rental housing into affordable home ownership because they can't afford the deposits. And therefore, or students coming into housing and taking up the stock, or Airbnb or short-term rental. So there's a lot going on in the marketplace. And it's really stepping back from it all, taking a breath and understanding all those different drivers and ensuring that we've got the correct policies in place that actually impact on those issues, right? As opposed to just putting all our resources in a particular segment, because I don't think we're going to achieve the results that we want to see in the long term.
No, and the other challenge, if you put all your focus on one segment of the housing continuum, is that you create unintended consequences or bulges in other parts or collapses in other parts. So, for example, when you don't have a clear path or a bridge to home ownership as a first-time buyer, it backs affluence into the rental market, which pushes down low-income renters further down the list, and that ends up dropping people onto the street as homeless. And so you've got to have a housing policy that deals with the full continuum of housing, and you have to watch what the impact is of overreacting to one part and while you underreact to another part, because it'll soon enough come back to haunt you. And a perfect example of that is the issue around speculation. Speculation is driving up land values so quickly, it's making building social housing more difficult than it's ever been. The previous,
because the land costs so much. Because the land costs so much money.
It's land. I mean, land, and it's you can, density plays a role in it, and the availability of density to some, but not to all, and density being privileged to those that can buy it effectively, even further accelerates that. And then you start to take a look at also some of the financialization that's occurred in the management of the financial system, which housing exists within. And that's gone just bonkers. It's probably the part of the puzzle which is the hardest to fix. But if it's not fixed, none of the other parts will work.
Mike, I follow you on Twitter. You got a lot of charts and graphs about this stuff all the time. The average house price in Toronto and Vancouver is over $1 million now. Other communities aren't that far behind in terms of those kind of prices. The median household income in Canada is $62,000. Where are people living?
It's a great question. And increasingly, they're living in smaller centers. And part of that's driven by land costs and some of the things that Adam mentioned. But the places that are growing in Ontario are not the big cities. It's not Toronto's and Mississaugas and Bramptons. It's Thorold, a community just outside of St. Catharines. It's Lucan Biddulph, which is just outside of London, Ontario. So we see all of these sort of exurbs growing because there's this exodus of young families out of the GTA, particularly out of the city of Toronto, because you simply can't afford a home there. So they do something called drive until you qualify, where they hop into a car and they drive as far as they need to go in order to qualify for a house. So, the number of children living in the city of Toronto is at lows we haven't seen since at least the early 1980s, despite the fact that Toronto's population as a whole has gone up, that we've created these conditions where cities are for people who don't have children. And if you do have children, again, you're living in a Lucan or a Thorold or a Woodstock. You're not living in a large city.
Isn't that sort of a natural evolution, though? Isn't that what Manhattan is?
Well, I'd say in part. I mean, that we always had a bit of a transition. That 50 or 60 years ago, people might have moved from downtown Toronto to Etobicoke, which is now part of Toronto. 30 or 40 years ago, they might have moved to a Mississauga or a Brampton. But now the distance that they're having to move to find a house is one thing to move 20 or 30 kilometers away and then be able to, in many cases, still take the GO train or transit or that kind of thing. But if you're moving to Tillsonburg, but you're still working on Bay Street, that's going to cause a lot of issues. And we're having this problem, which predates the pandemic, of you can either choose to raise a family or you can work in Toronto, but you can't do both. And it's causing families to make these distinctions, make these decisions. Hopefully the movement to work from home will help, but we have to remember a lot of jobs you can't work from home. You can't be a school teacher, an ECE, a doctor, or a nurse and work from home. So that will solve some of these issues, but certainly not all of them.
When I first got into politics in 2006, one of the things I did is I pulled all the development agreements in the riding or the ward that I was going to represent and took a look at them just to understand what had been built over the last 10 years. And I was also looking to see where the development charges had gone and what had been built to accommodate the growth and the density, which is largely occurring in the downtown core of Toronto. What stuck out and astounded me was that 98.7% of the units were one bedroom or less. If you build a city that doesn't have a bedroom for a child, the chances of you creating a child might be very good, but the chances of you housing a child are very poor. and I was called crazy for demanding that 10% of all units have 3 bedrooms or more. And at first, the industry was telling me that I should never interfere with the market. And secondly, the planning department said that we had no planning criteria to require these thresholds. And it just simply wasn't true. The city used to require bandwidths of different sized housing units to accommodate differently configured households. And they surrendered it in the mid-70s because the social housing program of the federal government was so strong. That's what was providing family housing at a low cost. And when the federal government in the early 90s started in the late 80s, but it was really done in the early 90s, and then downloaded the city of Toronto in the mid 90s, when that happened and we pulled away from providing housing, we created the circumstances that we're living with now. We have the market driving what sold yesterday that they hope to build today and sell tomorrow, and then just go back to the existential cycle of what sells. And they don't want to be told what to do. And if you tell them what to do, they say, well, that's red tape and interfering with the production of housing and it's driving up costs. And so don't do any planning. Well, I think Mike's data shows that if you don't plan for the next 25 years, you're not building a city. You're just building doors and floors in a city, and you're not actually accommodating the demographic thrust of the population. And that's where Toronto finds itself. And it also finds itself in an unaffordable crisis driven by a lot of speculation, both onshore, offshore, some of it healthy, some of it really bad. And that financialization piece, as much as the density piece, has to be constantly referred to.
Well, Herle Burlyites, and with apologies to Jim Morrison, this is the end. My only friend. The end. No, not of the pod. For 12 weeks now, we've been telling a story on behalf of our presenting sponsor, TELUS, on how we get 5G wireless connectivity right across all of Canada, not just in our biggest cities, but all rural, remote, and Indigenous communities too. This is the final chapter in that story, the consultation culmination. Throughout these last few months, the feds have been involved in public consultations, trying to figure out the best way to auction a new, critical mid-band of 5G, one that can carry huge amounts of data over great distances, with the potential to have great impact on every single household in Canada, urban and rural. Well, those consultations are nearing an end. See, there's a theme here. Here's the most important outcome of whatever policy decision the feds take. It's that companies invest and actually build their 5G networks, especially in rural Canada, so that everyone has access. TELUS is already doing that, and TELUS believes a 100 megahertz caps per carrier policy is the best way to promote competition and spur the other carriers to build networks too. Because with 100 megahertz caps, it means that 4 different carriers will have enough of that spectrum to launch their networks equally in every market. There'd be more urgency to get 5G up and running sooner, and then compete aggressively on service. What will it mean to you? Healthcare innovation and faster and broader access to it. Precision agriculture technologies that'll make our food chain far more efficient and help fight climate change. The ability to do business from anywhere in Canada to anywhere around the world. And dramatically expanded opportunities for remote learning. What will it mean to the country? Only a leading role in the world's innovation economy and $40 billion added to our GDP over the next 5 years. So yes, Herle Burlyites, that's the end of our story, but it's the potential beginning of so much opportunity, if only we get 5G right for everyone. Go to telus.com/get5G-right to have your say in this. Okay, Diana, could you ground us here a little bit? Because I don't know enough to follow this conversation right now. So can you help me come along with everybody else? I'm going to sort of try to divide up into this conversation up into 2 segments. One is social housing and homelessness, that side of things. And the other is what I would call middle class affordability, which is, I think, what's driving the politics around this right now, if not the sense of urgency. But what has happened to housing prices to get them to as high as they are? Is this a pure supply and demand issue? And if so, why has supply gotten so out of whack with demand? Or are there other factors involved? What is the reason why housing prices are up 20% year over year over year? What's going on?
Well, we've had a big surge in demand. We have a demographic shift, and even you can look at population growth numbers, and maybe you can say they're not growing very quickly, but we have a coming of age of a big demographic, the millennials. They're now well entrenched in the age 25 to 44 years old. They're looking for home ownership. They're looking to start families. They're not mid-career, but they're advanced in their careers already. And we just haven't built enough housing to meet that demand, or the right type of housing. As Adam has been saying, we're building one-bedroom condos where they maybe want a ground-related house with a backyard where they can allow their children to play. Although I do think that with less supply, people are readjusting their expectations of what they can actually live in. And so what we're seeing is a lot of households looking for places to live, not very many options. So they're bidding the prices up. So people who can afford them can push the prices up to unaffordable levels for the average household.
So you really do view this purely as a supply. There's just not enough supply. That's the issue.
Correct. The right type of supply.
There's some other things that are driving price as well. For example, I owned a condo in downtown Toronto when I was an MP and represented the area. And when I renewed my mortgage, I was given $250,000 as a line of credit without even asking for it. If I had been, I guess, smart, or if I had decided to take that line of credit and fold it over into 5 new condominiums and rent them out, in 10 years, I would have had 5 times 5, 25 condominiums. I would have been a real estate mogul. And that's all on speculated value. The price of my condo went up, but then the bank advanced me $250,000 without me even asking for it, and didn't care if I had invested in 5 more condos. And in doing so, I could just keep eating the housing market and then turn around and rent it to make sure that I can make the payments on my line of credit. When you have a financial system that is funded off of speculation and theoretical values, it's a housing bubble. And Mike's the economist; he'll know that when you do economic bubbles, the first thing people look at and study as to where a market is dysfunctional is they look at housing bubbles. We're in a housing bubble, and it's going to explode. And when it explodes, it's going to take a lot of people with it as they go below water on their mortgages, and then they can't drive to afford something. They'll be locked in their mortgage for a long time regardless. And that financialization piece is even bigger than what I just described.
I think Adam is confusing speculation and investment. And the type of investment that you described that you could have potentially done would have added to supply, because you would have taken a unit and you've added to the rental market. So in large part, government policies in Canada to address equity and affordability in the 1980s or 70s during the 1970s was expanding credit to builders and homeowners so that they can afford housing and also to create housing. So speculation, I don't disagree that we could probably start talking about a potential bubble in the housing market. I don't think we're quite there yet, and I don't expect it to burst. But I don't think that demographic shifts met with not enough demand that drive prices up are inconsistent with the concept of a bubble.
Except that when I buy 5 and then 25 condos, I have to pay the interest on that, and I'm charging somebody more money than it costs me to own the house, which means my investment is speculating a return on that investment that's enough to service my debt. And when that happens, and you introduce sort of brokers in the middle of the housing supply and the housing ownership model, that value added boost that I'm putting to a unit and not living in it forces someone to rent it and doesn't allow them to buy it, and inflates the price simultaneously. And when you have a system that's financing itself in that direction, you're going to find people, and there are all kinds of them in the condos in downtown Toronto, who own 7 or 8 condominiums and rent them out either through Airbnb or to long-term rents.
But isn't that rational, Adam? Isn't that rational economic behavior? Like, what in Canada is a better investment than real estate over the last 10 years? If you had money to invest in something, what would you put it into that would be a better idea than real estate?
It's an exclusive market, and it market that rewards capital as opposed to rewards capacity to pay.
Mukhtar?
I was just going to add to that, in that the cheap money and the way that the regulations allow someone to basically hoard property in a way. There's an element of profiteering, I think, that's going on at the moment, and because of the fact that the regulations are pretty lax and allow a lot of people to put up money in small amounts for potentially higher capital increases. And what that does is takes out existing supply, and therefore the demand is exponentially increased, because what you did have on the market is now being taken out for rental or investment purposes. And those people that are looking to buy, as Dinah said, if you've got a high group of people that are wanting to purchase housing and just can't access that stock, then that makes that a much more active market. I mean, if you look at some of the other countries, some of the ways that they've tried to minimize the pressure on households was to seek for investment in new stock. So you're encouraging new supply, and that existing housing is really not open for investment trusts or investors in the same way. So there's a hurdle to jump to buy existing rental, but there's much more incentives to encourage new supply. So investors put that money to create that new supply. And in that case, that's a valid investment, because you're taking a risk and you're going to get a reward. If you're buying up existing stock like toilet paper from your Costco and you're hoarding it and the price goes up or there's not enough supply, then that's where you have these kinds of pressures being put on people on average incomes who just can't afford to buy a home, whether that's a small home or a large home. And part of the process is, how do you regulate that? Because there's an element of government regulating and deregulating, and we've heard recent papers on how deregulation of the planning process allows more supply to come through, but regulation on how investors access market and speculate in the marketplace, how you regulate land use. I mean, there's many projects that go through the planning process that aren't developed and speculated on, because the developer pushes for the higher density, gets the higher density, and then sells it, and then it moves on. So it's not just the actual properties, it's land that's been flipped as much as it is property. What that does is ties up the planning department, who is then having to increase the density to accommodate the fact that the landowners or the developers paid for a parcel of land, anticipating a lift. And what happens is that parcel sold, and the next developer overpays, and then it goes back into the planning. And then we found in Vancouver, when we did a study, we had 15,000 lots of housing that just hadn't been developed, and gone through a really complex rezoning process, tying up the planning departments, and the housing wasn't built. And one of the things I guess we could be looking at is time-limited planning consents, because if you only got 5 years to build your development, you either develop it or you lose your consent. Will encourage more developers to bring supply to the table.
I don't know about all of you Hurly-Burlyites, but I feel like we're all sticking our noses out of our winter dens and up toward the sun, trying to suss out whether all this normalcy is real. And fair enough. Some of us are still working from home. Some of us are returning to the office for the first time in years. Yes, years. Think about that. Some of us are masked, some aren't. Most COVID restrictions are gone. But most of us also know someone who's sick right now. It's unsettling. Put it all together with inflation at a 20-year high, interest rates, the price of gas, and war in Europe, and it's nervous-making, anxiety-producing. The more than 20,000 railroaders who work for our sponsor, CN, live in the same world as all the rest of us. They just came off a fall and winter that brought some of the harshest weather anyone can remember. But railroaders have a heavy responsibility at the best of times. Never mind during a war that has devastated one of Europe's principal agricultural centers. Canadian grain is in high demand worldwide as a result, and CN hauls Canadian grain to seaports, along with major cities here and in the U.S. The same goes for fuel, minerals, cars, other agri-foods, in just about any manufactured product you'd care to mention. Buying a new lawnmower or barbecue this spring? It came by train. Lumber for renovations? Came by train. New furniture? Train. As I've said here before, events will take their course. Are we back in normal? I suppose we'll see, won't we? But here's an absolute certainty. CN's railroaders will be working overtime to fulfill cargo shipments safely and on time. They kept working right from day one of the pandemic. The rail network they run is the cardiovascular system of an economy that's starting to get some exercise again, to torture a metaphor. CN will stay focused on its customers. It's a matter of public service. My understanding is that there is no relationship between Canada's immigration targets on an annual basis and building supply of housing in various communities. Like, these two things happen in complete silos. The federal government does immigration policy and municipalities do, and there's no coordination of that. That seems bizarre to me. Am I wrong, or is that part of the problem here?
Can I add to that too? It's not just immigration, but economic policy. Like, the federal government put a lot of weight on supporting the tech industry in recent years, and they have programs that fast track immigration for people who work in tech related industries. These are industries that have high paying jobs, but account for a small share of the jobs. So we've brought in a lot of high income earning people. We haven't provided the appropriate amount of housing for them. So it's no wonder that we've seen this inequitable outcome in housing occur when that program was introduced.
Well, exactly. We keep asking, like, why are there so many luxury one-bedroom condos? Well, it's because we're bringing in, and I think for very good economic reasons, but we're bringing in a lot of tech talent and a lot of international high-income workers. Those are who's living in these things. And I should push back a little bit on the, investors and rental. This is not a golden age for renters, that there's this massive amount of rental stock because investors are buying up these properties and renting them out. We are seeing massive levels of rent evictions. We are seeing in the Niagara area.
What's a rent eviction? Sorry.
What a rent eviction is. So you've got a person who owns a house, rents it out, that house price goes up, and then they renovate the house, which allows them to kick out the existing tenant, and then they flip it and they sell it to often owners. We're seeing this a lot in the Niagara region. We're seeing places that used to be fairly low income rentals get renovated, get basically gentrified and sold to families that are moving in from the Toronto area. So it's not the case that all of this ownership stock is getting turned into rental. We have a lot of rental stock that's getting turned into ownership because of this housing shortage. So I'm going to push back a bit on this idea that, we've got all these, all of this is getting turned into rental stock. In a lot of the communities, it's exactly the opposite, that we're losing rental stock to ownership.
But the stock of affordable housing is also disappearing through that process, because what's happening is you pool affluence in the rental market. Big corporate funds move in and say, we'll pick up an underperforming building. We'll give it a new coat of paint on it and change the carpets and give it a nice fancy name. And you will renovate the affordable rental out. So the barista at the coffee shop down the street loses their apartment, and the tech immigrant comes in and takes it, and the rent goes up. And so the financialization of the rental stock, which is a global phenomenon, but it is really hammering Toronto hard. The real estate income trusts around real estate are buying up multi-res, and they are pushing affluence into low-income buildings. And that is one of the things that's also contributing to the rise of homelessness, because the rent eviction is also pushing people out of the rental market to nowhere.
Yeah, but I would say it's not just big corporations. It's a lot of Gen Xers who read Rich Dad, Poor Dad back in the 1990s and, started buying up houses in the last few years. So, to blame this on big international
corporations. It feels to me like it's a part of the activity now. So my house in downtown Toronto has appreciated significantly over the last decade. Yep. And most people I talk to think I should be borrowing against that house to buy more real estate. Right? That's the consistent advice I get, is why don't you take a $500,000 line of credit against that house and buy a condo and start renting out that condo or something? So it feels to me like it is part of the world of real estate now.
Absolutely. So yes, corporations do play a role, but we've seen the enemy, and it's us. It's a lot of existing homeowners who do exactly what Adam described earlier of get out sort of second mortgages, or basically take their existing equity and use that equity to buy additional properties. So this is not just a corporate thing, though corporations do play a role.
While we're on equity, I just want to ask a question that is of particular interest to me, but maybe of broader interest. In order for housing to be more affordable, does the price of my house have to go down?
A lot.
Is that right?
Well,
currently.
Well, I guess not. Well, it potentially could go down
because I've already spent that money on my retirement.
Yeah.
Seriously, I'm not joking. Like, that money's banked.
Right. I mean, most people, if you're living in your own home, unless you're going to sell it or as you said, borrow against it, you're not really going to recognize the value, because if you sell your property to buy another one, that one's appreciated and the net gain isn't as huge as it can be. It's fine if you retire to somewhere where there's costs that are lower. And that's the challenge that we're seeing, is that many of the investors have been investing in the Toronto and Vancouver market, when I've been trying to get funds interested in investing in some of the smaller communities. And I did a development in Hope, BC, which was about 200 kilometers away from Vancouver. 6,000 population, hadn't had any rental for the last 30 years. And in the past, at that time, values weren't that great. This is back in 2017. We were able to get double the density because the council was really supportive of the project. They wanted to see more rental come in, especially affordable rental. We built modular building there, which is a different story. But the story there was that what we found is that the house prices increasing 20%, because you've had this ripple effect of people coming out further and further because that's what they could afford. They ended up their existing housing being sold. The people that were renting didn't have anywhere to go. We found when we were going through that process of getting that rental built that we didn't have any data. CMHC didn't have any data because there's no rental stock to consider as a statistical significance. But we had that property 3-4 times oversubscribed to 40 units with all sorts of people that were either living in motels because they couldn't find any existing housing stock. But what we see is that if you don't strengthen the smaller communities and invest in those, that those people that become homeless will only go to the place where there are services and housing opportunities, which are the urban centres. So there is a strong case to be made in terms of investing in those smaller communities that are losing that existing rental to homeowners who are now moving out of those big urban centres, to try and see how you can create housing supply in those smaller communities where people can stay within their network of friends and family, rather than having to come to Vancouver and Toronto and fall into a lot more vulnerabilities, which add additional challenges to the system.
Can I stay with you for a second, Mukhtar? What's the role of foreign money in all of this?
I think what you see
governments put on foreign buyers taxes, and they seem to cool down the market for a bit. Why is a non-resident allowed to own residential property in Canada?
It goes back to my point about whether you have investors buying existing stock or new or invest in new housing supply. I think you see that globally, whether you go Singapore, New Zealand, Australia. We've had globalization of money, and it flows around the world, finding the opportunities. And where regulations and opportunities allow them, that's where the investment will go. Obviously, with the foreign buyer tax, that did stop some of the money coming in. But again, compared to what is going on around the rest of the world, Canada is an attractive place to invest. But that's not to say a lot of the investment isn't coming from people locally. Like you said, people borrowing against their property and buying as 2 or 3 properties. The challenge we have is transparency and data. We can't make good policy without knowing some of these facts and figures so that we can actually address these. There's a lot of speculation about all of these issues, and we don't really know for sure. And I think it's important that we do gather data and be transparent about it, because the problem we have sometimes is that there's a blame game and a politicization of the information, which means that
hey, that's the business I'm in, man.
Yeah, I know. But at the end of the day, the outcome, which is
it's easy to attack somebody who doesn't have a vote, right?
Right.
It's appealing, but everything we've talked about so far is a slice of this pie. And the trouble is, if you only attack one piece of the pie, the other pieces of the pie just sort of, as you take the piece you want to eat out, the other pieces of the pie just kind of mold back into the pie again. And you have to do all of these things at the same time. You've got to build livable, sustainable, and affordable neighborhoods that have much more capacity to house people in many more different ways. You've got to reform the financial sector so that speculation is not fueling speculation, and slow it down and give people that bridge to home ownership, but at the same time dissuade the multiple owners. So you've got to get down to one house per person and for Canadians, and prioritize that and model that. And then you've got to start building smarter. We cannot just build 40-story condos and four-bedroom houses out in the suburbs. The hyper-intensification and the mega sprawl have affordability and sustainability dynamics attached to them, which are going to destroy whatever we're trying to do here.
You're talking about more bedrooms in the condos. You're not talking about not condos. Like, we shouldn't be building any more detached single family units in Toronto, should we?
I don't think it's sustainable. If we're going to endlessly sprawl, our wetlands get eaten up, our capacity to manage floods disappear, the pollution from all the driving starts to overwhelm.
To go back to the Manhattan thing, nobody who lives in Manhattan expects to live in a house with a yard.
And that's that mindset has got to change to a degree, and it is changing to a degree. I mean, you do find families in 3-bedroom condos, in 3-bedroom units, in tall condos, but when you intensify everything, you also lose, because we're trying to build more housing on less land. Things get edited out in the design process, and so you don't have a front and backyard. So where do the kids and the dogs go? Well, then you need parks, and if you need parks, you're going to start to spatialize the city. If you start to spatialize, if you put a new park in every neighborhood, you're taking housing and opportunities for business away, and you're spreading the city out again. So you've got to find a sweet spot, and I would argue it's got to be reverse engineered to what's an ideal, affordable, sustainable, and livable neighborhood that houses many, many more people. And Mike can probably give you the target number, but you've got to then re-engineer your planning regime so you optimize that kind of housing, and you disqualify the housing which underperforms and quite frankly is the status quo, which is either 40 stories tall or 4 bedrooms in the suburbs. You've got to find something in the middle. It's often referred to as the missing middle. It's not in of itself a solution to affordability, but it is around sustainability a solution. It is around livability a solution. And at the end of the day, if you can get enough of it online, you can then figure out how to rewire the market so that it becomes affordable. And that's what's in front of us.
Adam, you're making it sound so complicated. You're making me think nothing can ever happen.
No, look at it.
There's so many moving parts, and there's so many considerations, and it just doesn't feel like governments are grappling or able to grapple with the issue that way.
Fix the financing and address homelessness. And if you do those 3 things simultaneously with some vigor behind it, you're going to see the housing market return to some normalcy, and people are going to have less anxiety about the choices because they will have choices. This is about facilitating people's choice. And part of that choice is price, but also part of it is sustainability.
I do think, though, the type of housing that we're talking about, infilling in the neighborhoods, like, you're not going to get a big developer that's going to come in and build a multiplex, 3 stories in a single family home. These are going to be these smaller investors. And financing is important because they need to finance that investment. And so they need to back that financing with something. And normally it's going to be the real estate they already own. And
Vancouver saw this, that kind of niche building. Every lot that can accommodate a house behind a house doubles in price. And nobody sells a house in the annex for less than they think they can get in the annex. And the other thing is the Urban Land Institute has run the numbers on it. It costs about $100 more a square foot, about $1,100 a square foot to build a house like that. It costs about $1,000 to build it in a condo. And so you've also got to get at the labor shortage and the materials shortage that is also part of the equation here. Mike McGee is a former chief of staff of the Vancouver mayor who's looking at the issue of rebar. We buy most of the rebar for the West Coast from Malaysia, and most of the rebar from Malaysia is recycled steel from Canada. Put that, so we're sending collapsed shipping containers to Malaysia, courtesy of the Chinese state enterprise. They recycle it into rebar, and then we buy it back because it's cheaper than doing it from Hamilton. He's got a proposal, a fascinating proposal, to recycle the metal in Canada and put people to work and drop the cost of rebar, and he can't get it financed by a bank.
So when I read about this issue, when I read about supply and demand, the one thing I read most of is regulations. We can't build enough because there's excessive regulations. Now, when I hear developers complaining about regulations, my spidey sense gets highly attuned. Maybe it shouldn't. What are we talking about here? What kind of regulations are preventing building?
Well, I'll give you a classic one. So we're building a lot of LRTs and subways and things like that in order to get people to use public transit. And then when we put buildings next to those lines, we still have parking minimums. We require a certain amount of parking in buildings that are designed so people could use public transit. So I really dislike this framing about regulation versus deregulation. It's not that we need more regulation or less. We need sensible regulation. That our systems are sort of completely out of date. There's this big disconnect, as you mentioned earlier, between what we're trying to do on the economy and labor issues with what we're trying to do with housing. So it's basically just looking at these things and going, okay, is what we're doing, does it accord with what we're trying to do in the labor market? Is it compliant with our net zero climate targets and those kinds of things? So rather than going, okay, this is about having more regulation or less regulation, it's rather, are our regulations aligned with what we're trying to accomplish as a society?
I appreciate some regulations that try to limit externality. So unlike Mike, I do think sometimes parking minimums, the market's not going to deliver parking to people who need it. And even if you live beside transit stations, it's unrealistic to think that two people in a household are going to work in the same location and both can use transit. One may have to drive to their place of employment. The kind of regulations that I get more concerned about are the ones that are costly and limit competition so that only the bigger developers can navigate. So, the framework here in Toronto where you need to produce 20 to 30 different types of studies, and I can't remember them all because there's too many, just to pitch your development to the city. Now, the city is broken and, application processes can range up to 30 months, so almost 3 years. And that's if you have a favorable application, not if you have to negotiate with the municipality. Altus has done work that showed that for every month that a application is in at the city, it costs the developer about $1.73 per square feet. There are up to $2,000 per unit. There are 503 units in the application process right now in the City of Toronto alone. That additional cost per month is upwards of thousands of units that could be built with that money. So it's actually quite fairly costly. Only the big developers can navigate it. So you're giving a competitive advantage to the bigger developers, and you're not allowing the smaller ones who would maybe build the missing middle type housing to compete.
Adam, you've had a unique vantage. You've had a unique vantage point of having been at both City Council in Toronto and in the corridors of power in Ottawa with respect to housing policy. What happens to housing policy at the governmental level? Why is it being unsuccessful?
Well, part of the problem is fractured jurisdiction. No one level of government is totally accountable for the housing system. And as a result of that, you've got competing worldviews that are doing sometimes ridiculously counterproductive things. Recently the province of Ontario announced that if you can't get a building permit issued in 30 days, it's free. Planning departments run on a cost recovery basis. If you start cutting their salaries, how many planners do you think you're going to have to lay off? And then how everyone's going to get it for free, but because there'll be no planners left. And it's not smart, intelligent system building. It's destructive sort of populism that looks like it's doing something, but at the end of the day, it's a bunch of lawyers sitting around the table instead of developers and architects and tenant groups. It's a legal process that's adversarial, and that creates its own problems. So from my perspective, cities don't have the capacity they need to build cities. And cities build better cities than the provinces and the federal governments do. Cities are very good at building cities. That's why we all live in them. And we need to match the resources with the accountability. We have to stop having appeal upon appeal upon appeal. I put a building through when I was a city councillor on King Street. While I was approving the building, the developer came back and asked for 6 more floors, one at the OMB. And while that was being approved and site planned, he came back and asked for another 6 floors and then did another 6 floors on top of that. And nothing was built. And we were tied up in this sort of incremental creep of this building that was frustrating because we said yes. We kept saying yes, and he kept coming back and saying, I want some more. And, there may be reasons for that. The market changes, land values change, his financing bails on him, and he needs to figure it out. And he's taking so long to build it. Those costs start to mount too. But at some point, the developer has to take a little responsibility as well. We talked about the situation of unbuilt property in Vancouver. There's close to 50,000 approved building project, 50,000 units approved in the Toronto pipeline that haven't been built. And you can take away the permissions, but that doesn't get the housing built.
So are you saying that if you just let the city of Toronto, if you just gave it the authority and resources, that it knows what to do?
Well, there's some other caveats to that. I mean, I do not like the status quo, and I think that the city of Toronto makes some atrociously bad planning decisions. There was a debate on Twitter that we're all part of this last weekend of a 14-story building on the Yonge subway line. That shouldn't even be an argument. But somebody said, "We'll add some more floors, and you'll get some more affordability." Well, you won't get more affordability. $1,000 a square foot is $1,000 a square foot. A 500 square foot apartment is going to sell for $500,000. But what happens when you add more floors to a 14-story building is you have to add an elevator shaft because all of a sudden the one you've put there isn't good enough. And adding 2 or 3 more floors actually takes out a floor per unit. 10 units per floor, you lose 14 units as you put 2 more floors on. So at a certain point, you run into yourself. So you've got to optimize what the right building size is. You've got to incent it. In other words, drop the DCs for the good buildings and jack them up for single family homes and jack them up for tall skyscrapers that are terrible environmental performers. And you've got to say, that's what we want to build. And that's what we're going to prioritize. We're going to make it as of right. So you don't have to apply for 12 amendments to get a simple building built. And the other projects, which are the outliers, which are creating the hyper intensification and the hyper sprawl, we're just not going to do that sort of building anymore because it's not sustainable, it's not livable, and it's not affordable anymore. So prioritize it and re-engineer your planning system to deliver what you need instead of what you don't want.
Do we have to choose between nice things? Is the green belt driving up the cost of housing?
No, there's still 25% of the land that's within the greenbelt hasn't been developed. It's been set aside for housing. You don't need to expand the greenbelt. The greenbelt is developed.
You mean you don't need to shrink the greenbelt?
You don't need to touch it. What the greenbelt pressure is developers who are buying low and buying land that nobody wants and can't afford because there's no development rights on it, and then working the back rooms to get a ministerial permit to violate the environmental policy. The
rest of you agree the greenbelt's not a problem?
Yeah, I actually looked at it, and I looked at just all the available empty land around transit stations across Ontario, major transit stations. And if you just allowed right-of-way zoning around them, you could build enough housing through multiplexes and townhomes to meet population demand for the next 50 years.
Yeah,
really?
And it's the same in Vancouver. You've got strip malls, you've got car parks, you've got a lot of vacant land that could be used to densify.
Yeah, so I agree, and I don't think the Greenbelt's a problem. But one of my big concerns is that people will point to it. If we don't build enough houses for our 20 and 30 something, say, there's no land here, they're going to go, well, what about those forests and swamplands over there? Why don't we build houses over there? I don't think that the Greenbelt 20, 30 years from now, unless we get our act together, I don't think it's going to have the social license to continue to exist. Because if you ask a 25-year-old, what do you want, a house or the Greenbelt? That's not going to be a hard decision for most of them.
So we got to solve this problem some other way if we want to keep the pressure
up has to be solved
off the Greenbelt.
The urgency that Mike places on this. We the other risk is that all these talented techno kids leave. They're global citizens. They can work in Barcelona just as easily as they can in downtown Toronto. And the other side of this is if we destroy downtown Toronto, they might just leave because of that as well. One of the things we dealt with in Toronto was the warehouses. The reason we have a really high performing tech sector beyond the educational systems is that the telephone lines, the technology lines cross in downtown Toronto, and the warehouses surround that technological reality. And so there's a lot of hospitals, a lot of finance, a lot of technology. It's a perfect place to have a tech center. It was housed in warehouses, and every time we blossom a new company and hire 100 new people, we squash one of those warehouses and the companies leave the city. So we're building a city where there's no work. And this notion of not everyone on a transit line is going to the same place, and one might drive, one might take transit, so you need parking, ... We have an exclusionary zoning policy, not just around the missing middle. We separate work, and we separate play, and we separate living spaces and recreational spaces. And we've been doing it since the Second World War. And that spatial separation of multidisciplinary and multifunctional land use planning is not the way the old city was built, and is not why the city of Toronto is successful. Yet we've been doing it endlessly. Yorkdale Mall. It's insane in this day and age to have a parking lot that big in the middle of nowhere doing nothing. It should be housing.
So I think I'm picking up partly on what Adam was talking about. But, one of the things I think about, and maybe it's a dumb thing to think about, but it's one of the things I think about, is what does it do to a city when the people who service the community don't live in the community? So what happens? I mean, Mike, you've made the point about children in Toronto, but what happens when I'm living in a city where the people who teach my kids don't live in that city, the people who police me don't live there, the people that would put out my fires don't live there? Nobody that actually provides the services to me can afford to live where I live. What are the impacts of that?
Well, I think that's going to be a problem, and I often hear that some of Toronto's affordability.
It's so different from how I grew up in Regina, which was just a complete melange of everybody, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. Same in East London, where I'm from. Same thing. And I have that concern. I mean, I hear sometimes from politicians that one of the ways we could solve Toronto's affordability crisis for families is $10 a day daycare, and I'm a big fan of the program. I think absolutely this needs to happen, but I just look at it like, who's going to work in those daycares? Who can afford to live in the city of Toronto in a daycare program? And I think where we're going to solve this, unfortunately, I do not think this is going to be good for society, is those workers that you mentioned, they're going to be temporary foreign workers, and they're going to be living in rooming houses and that kind of thing, because nobody's going to be able to, be a daycare worker or work at Chipotle or you name it, all those important things that we need in our city. You can't live in the city of Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal on those kinds of salaries. So then, we're going to have to get people from elsewhere, and we end up exploiting foreign labor because we can't get domestic labor to work at that salary.
One of the hospitals on Hospital Row on University Avenue had its IT system collapse one weekend on a long weekend, and they brought in a whole shift of specialists and paid them double the time and a half to fix it. And after 8.5 hours, they couldn't get it fixed, and they had to look at bringing another shift of IT workers in, or paying these people 4 times what they were normally going to get. It was going to take 2.5 hours to mobilize the labor force because they didn't live in the downtown core close to the hospital. And so the hospital ended up paying 4 times over rate for the IT workers to fix the system. So it's not just a question of not having the ecosystem of workers to feed all the needs of the city and including them in the city so they have a place to live, but it drives up labor costs to the point where the hospital starts to think, you know what, all our workers are out in Ajax. We're gonna relocate to Ajax because it's closer. And so then you start to see the migration of work out of the downtown core, and you get a flip of what happened in the 70s and 80s of a hyper concentration of work downtown and residential out. And all of a sudden you get commercial on the outskirts and you get Manhattan in the downtown, and everyone's commuting by car to get to their workplace miles and miles away from the downtown core. You've got to rebalance the planning equation.
Yeah, I was going to say, even here in London, UK, as you mentioned, the central London does become more expensive, but you then set programs where you have inclusionary zoning. I know Vancouver, we've had 20% as part of the development programs for quite some time now, and I know in Toronto you're starting to introduce that. So, and also you look to your non-profit sector to build up their capacity so that they can hold on and retain that affordable housing for the long term. And utilizing the federal, provincial, municipal, non-profit existing land holdings, and seeing how you can maximize those assets to increase the amount of housing on that. And again, in the downtown east side plan in Vancouver, we gave extra zoning benefits to affordable social housing so that they could create more supply within those parcels of land. So, and that way you integrate a much more diverse community within the whole city rather than, So I think that those potential options are there, but again, it needs a lot of support because the non-profit sector doesn't have a balance sheet, doesn't have the assets. CMHC doesn't have, as part of its national housing strategy, any focus on how to build that capacity up, and it's something I understand they are exploring. But we have to look at, as I said, the next 5-10 years. We're not going to solve this problem overnight. And I think short-term fixes just exacerbate the problem because a lot of resources go into that short-term fix. And therefore, you then pulling forward all the funding that would have been spent over a period of time to come up with a much more sustainable solution.
Oh, you're frustrating me, Mukhtar. We can't have a short-term solution. I want a short-term solution. You guys, I'm struggling because I'm learning. Go ahead, Diana. Sorry.
I just wanted to pick up on what Mukhtar just said. So to the point where, we can't, it's not helpful to make everybody's house price fall to restore affordability. I don't want that. You don't want that. The banks don't want that. The economy doesn't want that. But where we do have an opportunity is to build these affordable housing, and inclusionary zoning, I think if done properly, could be a really good opportunity to get affordable housing. Inclusionary zoning is if there's a development, you can require that X% of the units are deemed affordable based off of some formula. But you currently in Canada, a lot of the cities that use it as a tax. It's more like a tax to the developer. The developer is just required to build it. And so incidence of taxes, who pays the taxes? Usually the purchasers. So it's going to be fed down to people who are buying units in those buildings. So I think there's an opportunity, at least in the national housing strategy, to offer an opportunity to provide money and subsidies to inclusionary zoning units. I'd be interested. I disagree in terms of where that tax lands, in that the tax is actually on the landowner. If you're quite clear about the expectation on the 20% affordable housing up front, and we've done this process quite a bit here in the UK where we have the Section 106. If all the requirements are set up front, when you purchase the land, then those are factored into your land purchase. So those costs are then reducing the land price to a level which is then affordable to make that development work. The problem we have is that you have a developer and the landowner buying a piece of land and the negotiations happen afterwards and no one really knows where they're going to land. So everybody's expecting more from each other than is probably sustainable.
Yeah, okay, team. I'm learning a lot from this conversation, but I'm having trouble putting my arms around it.
Well,
let's say that Canada came to its senses and made me the prime minister, and that this was my number one priority. Where do I start?
I think that the missing tooth in the smile of the national housing strategy is the capital transfer to start cooperative rental housing for working. It's the missing piece. The biggest mistake we made in this country was killing the co-op housing program in the early 90s. That was the Martin Chrétien government as part of its balancing of the sheets. And Paul Martin will tell you it was the biggest mistake he made. When we lost that program, we plunged ourselves into this crisis, and we have yet to recover from it. So the first thing is to capitalize the co-op sector and remount that program, because it works. And it was on autopilot for a long time and delivered the housing we needed. And if you build enough good rental housing, people don't want to buy necessarily because their rent's so low, and they'd rather go on a trip or buy a cottage or send their kids to university because they like living in those low rent environments. So we have to massively overbuild for a while in the social housing sector, and in particular in the co-op sector. The second thing I think we fundamentally have to do is we have to attack every form of speculation in the market and just bring it down. You're not going to eliminate it. People buy houses and they expect them to go up in value, but you've got to stop these double-digit year-over-year, month-over-month increases, and you got to pull. I would immediately put a moratorium on foreign investment. Because it's not helping the situation. You can lift it as you start to build out, but that's the second thing I would do. And then you've got to demand cities to be smarter about how they do their planning, and you've got to reverse engineer them into the right kind of housing. Vancouver, you talk about the inclusionary zoning. Montreal does it better than Vancouver, but Montreal and Vancouver can do it better than Toronto because they don't have appeal bodies. And if you build a 40-story condo, your neighbor is not entitled to a 40-story condo in Vancouver and Toronto. But in Toronto, because the legal system around planning, if you get 40 stories, I get 40 stories. And what's worse, if I don't want to get 40 stories, the tax system taxes me as if I do have 40 stories. And so I'm forced into redevelopment. And you're going to watch, the Ontario line is coming through Queen Street. We're about to lose all of Queen Street. That's the last street with live music venue on it. If you think Toronto can afford to chase its artists out of the downtown core to build transit, what are you building transit for? What are they coming to visit beyond the casino at the CNE? And so we have got to build a better city. And I think
it's been a while since Doug Ford's been at the Horseshoe. But
the planning regime has got to be overhauled, and it's got to get smarter. But if you only do that, the other two things are going to catch up to you. So you've got to do three very specific things: overbuild social housing, in particular co-ops, restructure the financialization of housing so that it is aimed at helping individual homeowners secure their housing. And then you've got to retrofit the planning regimes so that you're building livable, affordable, and sustainable neighborhoods, which are going to be bigger, house more people, but they will also have to have more jobs in them, more recreation in them, because as you build more housing on less land, your kids still need a place to play. And if they don't have a backyard, they need a park. And so you've got to build balanced neighborhoods. Those three things are the way to go. But all those three things, the financialization is at the federal level, the planning is at the city level, and the social housing is at the provincial level. And if you've got three different governments not talking to each other, you've got a housing crisis.
Diana, how about you? What's the first thing to do? Where do you start?
I think that and I have to applaud Adam for the National Housing Strategy, which is the federal government $72 billion plan to invest in housing. $84 billion.
It'll be bigger tomorrow, I'm told.
Is any of it getting spent? I've read conflicting reports on that.
About $20 billion, so $4 billion a year, which is about only 1% of GDP. So that is my one criticism of it, is that it's actually still quite small relative to 1% of government expenditures and revenue, sorry. So it's still quite small relative to what it could be. The bulk of it actually isn't even government spending. It's loans that are repayable. So it's money the government's going to get back. So I do think there's a lot more room to expand it. Like I mentioned, what I would do, I would go back, and I think this is what Adam was trying to do with the National Housing Strategy, was go back to some of the policies that were implemented in the 1970s that really worked to help affordability and equity in the housing market. But I would go a step further. I would expand how much money federal government gives to municipalities to service land. So actually create land that can be buildable. Maybe they can, take more responsibility in providing funding for transit, parks, infrastructure needed to deliver water, electricity, etc. The other thing I would do too is there's a housing benefit. So as of April 1st, here in Ontario at least, I know other provinces are introducing too, households who are living with the most dire housing conditions are now eligible for a housing benefit to supplement their rent. And I think that's a really great program. I do think in the 1970s, they extended that to middle income households. So there might be able to be some room, I think, there to expand who's eligible for those housing benefits. And as I said, I would also like to see the National Housing Strategy provide incentives for inclusionary zoning units. That's the number one thing I would do, is I would expand how much the federal government is spending on the issue.
Interesting. Okay. Mike?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of things. So a lot of our population growth right now comes from two sources. One is immigration. And we announce our immigration targets with about 18 months worth of notice. And it takes more than 18 months to build a house or property. I'll defer to Adam on that one, but I'm pretty sure I'm right here that you can't build those properties in 18 months. So the first thing I would like to see is the federal government set 5-year immigration target, like 5 years in advance, so we could filter those numbers down to municipalities so that they'd have a better idea of how quickly their population is going to grow and can filter that into planning. The other big source is international students. And I think we need to have better sort of targets on that, better data on that, and have some requirements that colleges and universities actually build more places for them, because oftentimes they're living in communities and, and obviously they need somewhere to live, but a lot of single family homes are getting turned into student rentals out of necessity. And I think, I think a big
There's like 170,000. Aren't there?
Yeah, it's I'm not sure the exact numbers, but it's between international students and those working in the postgraduate work permit program, which basically you get a degree diploma and you can stay in Canada up to 3 years and then apply for permanent residency. It's a really good program. Don't get me wrong, but I
was just interjecting, Mike, because I'm not sure that everybody listening knows that universities are funding themselves with international students.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a bunch of reforms that go back to the Harper era. And I think a lot of them make sense. In Canada, we've always had a problem recognizing foreign credentials of international talent. So going back at least to 2008, and I'm sure prior to that as well, we've made a number of reforms in this country to, instead of having people immigrate over when they're 28 or 29 years old and have a degree, a diploma, a credential from some school we've never heard of, have them come over at 17 or 18, go to U of T or Sheridan or wherever you get a degree, diploma, then work in Ontario for up to 3 years under the permit program, then apply for permanent residency. And this is a very helpful thing because they get their credentials in Canada, employers have a sense of what these things are worth. All sensible things to do, but none of that has ever filtered into planning. So we have this huge population increase of people in their 20s and nowhere to house them. So I think we need to do something on that. I think finally, we need to set targets for our cities. The federal government can set targets for our cities, saying, okay, you need to be able to house this many people. And if you don't, start doing things like cutting back their gas tax revenue, saying, tying because the federal government doesn't have many levers beyond cash. So it's being able to tie those cash levers to outcomes that they're looking for.
Minneapolis St. Paul does that best, by the way. The carrot and stick approach to if you don't build enough rental housing, you don't get money to the hockey rink or the baseball diamond. And politicians like to cut ribbons to things like that. Yep. If you want to get that money to get reelected, you've got to build housing.
Yeah.
Where would you start, Mukhtar?
I like going last because I can say all of the above, but I agree with Adam. I'd add the nonprofit sector in terms of building that capacity up. I think CMHC maybe it should be split, because at the moment it's playing a Jekyll and Hyde approach in terms of being a commercial underwriter and trying to be a social housing funder. And I don't think it works in its current mode.
It was the vehicle, though, in the 70s and 80s, right? Before the Martin Kretschak cuts that Adam was talking about.
And
federal
back then,
housing policy was delivered through CMHC, right?
Back then, the profit of CMHC was invested into social housing. Now it goes into general government revenue. If CMHC kept all its profit, it could double the output of the national housing policy.
It's just that I think the market is so complex. It just needs a dedicated resource, especially since we haven't built the capacity of those non-profits and co-ops over the last 30 years. So there does need to be a dedicated resource to get to a stage. Again, given a UK example, we had societies that were similar. I mean, if you look at the number of societies in BC, we got 800 societies managing 75,000 homes, which is less than 100 per society. And that was on the back of the fact that they did their first redevelopments and then the funding stopped. Now we've got a very inefficient system where if you've got to keep the overhead of those societies going, and that means that subsidies are going in to support the overhead rather than affordability or creating new supply. The situation was different in the UK. Government invested 100% of the capital in the early years, built the societies to a scale where they were self-sufficient, and then they cut back the grant to allow them to then develop, leveraging the existing assets and resources. And over time, those societies now own 35,000 units or 100,000 units, and they are kicking off surpluses of over £100 million a year. So that long-term investment has come back to now support that ongoing affordable housing. That's what I was saying around investing for the future rather than the short-term gains. Because if you don't look to the future and invest, what we'll do is put a lot of money in those short-term solutions again, which are going to just aggravate the situation in the long term, because those hotels that are being currently bought will have to be refurbished and redeveloped, and where will those people go? So I think there's a long-term play there. And the commercial underwriting is important because, again, looking to enable the private sector, and it shouldn't be adversarial as well. I mean, everyone should play a strong part in delivering housing at all segments of the market, whether that's student housing, which is an investment class here in the UK, and you have a lot of investors that will invest in student housing, which takes away the pressure on the existing housing, or whether it's pension funds and others who are investing heavily in the UK affordable housing sector, but not so much in Canada. When I set up the Vancouver Affordable Housing Agency and we were leveraging city land, and we had 1,000 units in the pipeline. We went to the pension funds, and they basically said the non-profits don't have assets or balance sheet that we can secure our funding on. We don't get the same tax benefits, which then don't allow us to generate the returns that our pension liabilities have to meet. So they end up in other jurisdictions rather than staying in Canada and investing in that affordable housing. So finding a fair system to incentivize private investment in affordable housing, it should also be considered as part of a solution, and as well as investing in the non-profit sector.
So I'm having a weird reaction to this conversation.
You see that?
having a weird reaction to this conversation, which is that you are convincing me that there are practical things that can be done that would improve the situation. And you are making me more skeptical than ever that any of those things will happen. And that will actually make a lot of progress on this over the near term. It seems that the centers of power are too diffuse, that the issue is too complicated, that there's no short-term political win out of it. It just seems like the kind of thing that's going to drag on.
No,
am I wrong?
I disagree. I think that but the federal government's got to lead with money. The cities have to lead with a much more progressive and aggressive intensification and a smarter intensification. And the provinces have to stop brokering in the middle and messing it all up. the province is the outlier in all of this. And I just, you can argue they play the role of a regional government, but they sure don't act like it. And they sure don't do it in a way that's very coherent. And as a result, because they hold most of the cards around planning and most of the money around housing, and the Constitution tells us they do, we're imprisoned by it. So bold financial leadership on the federal level, a capital investment, reforming the housing borrowing market, and much smarter leadership at the city level. And to do that, stop appealing everything the city does and hold the bloody city accountable. And make the politicians bloody vulnerable. One of the worst things the province did was cut the number of councillors. If you mess up a neighborhood, you should be kicked out of office. Now you can mess up, sort of 4 out of 10, and you win because you got 6 out of 10 on side still. And that's the history of the city of Toronto since amalgamation. It's been broken by stupid provincial policy and poverty imposed on the city by other orders of government. You need to get better city halls. That's the most difficult of them all to fix, but you got to do it. But at the end of the day, if someone's not putting the capital into the system, you're not going to get it worked out. A house, you take the profit out of building a house and you get to 80% of market value. There's no way of reducing that. You need to subsidize it, and that requires wealth transfer.
Well, so I'm gonna, go ahead. I was gonna say. So I think there's two. I'm gonna play the role of dismal scientist, and I think there's actually two potential depressing outcomes. The first is what you mentioned, David. Just the lack of political will. It's complicated. You've got federal, provincial, municipal governments, higher education, all playing a role and not coordinating with each other. I have concerns about a second outcome, and the second outcome I'm worried about is that we may, in fact, have a housing crash. Just interest rates go up, white collar savings goes down, people start pulling their money out, which would be bad enough. But then when prices go down 20 or 30%, we all go, oh, problem solved. We don't have any issues on housing anymore. We have affordability. And we lose sight of all of these issues like homelessness that Adam mentioned, of, the sort of drive till you qualify out to Tillsonburg or wherever, that I'm concerned that prices may go down for a variety of reasons that are completely out of political control. And then we all step back from the issue and we worry about something else. I have that concern.
Although if prices go down because of interest rates, because of high interest rates, that doesn't actually do anything for affordability, does it?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. No, it's like you can have a lower down payment, but your monthlies are still really expensive. But if everybody, if people who just bought lost 20%, we're going to, naturally, there's going to be a lot of people who think that's a disaster. And I think on a personal level, they're not wrong. Yeah.
Higher interest rates are also bad for supply. So.
Yeah. And I think there's a practical, and I think Adam referred to it, that if people can't afford to buy or live, affordability, that they'll be looking to move, and that might be moving to other parts of the country or to other countries, and that would mean that Canada isn't going to be as competitive in the marketplace.
Isn't that an elite discourse? How many people can afford to? How many people have the option of moving to a different country? Like most people work in a minimum wage job somewhere. They don't have these mobility options. They just got to live with whatever it is.
If people don't have that mobility, why should capital?
Sorry,
Mukhtar, go back. I didn't mean to stop you. I just meant to.
No. When I say that, I'm talking about the newcomers that have been trying to come in, and there was the challenges around their certification. Looking at affordability, there's already media reports about a lot of the newcomers having to move on because they just can't settle and create a life here. But some practical solutions around that is addressing the needs in those smaller communities, as we spoke about earlier. They're now facing huge challenges because they've had an influx of people coming in who were able to pay a lot more for the housing stock, which has driven local people out of the housing supply, and creating housing in those smaller communities is much easier on the planning front. And if you look at a modular construction, you can construct within 12 months to 18 months. So you can get rapid housing being built in these smaller communities, low rise dense developments as opposed to the high rise developments, which go through a very complex process and take years to build. So there is a more immediate fix that could be created. And the Rapid Housing Initiative started that process, and perhaps as a route that can continue and does need federal money to keep that program going. But addressing needs across the continuum will be helpful.
Terrific. Listen, I want to thank all four of you for the generosity of your time and your ideas today, your insights. This was a really interesting conversation. It obviously tells me that this is a really long conversation to do properly, and there's a lot more to it. There'll be budgets and elections coming down the road, and I have learned a lot from you today, and maybe we can reassemble sometime in the future to assess progress or not progress being made. But there was a lot of different perspectives here today, really helpful, I think, for people trying to sort their way through this. So thanks a lot for joining me. And I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, our sponsor, CN Rail, and all you Herle Burlyites out there for listening again today. And come back next week and there'll be more. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Herle Burly.